I've always found peace in the wilderness. Growing up in northern Michigan, I spent countless hours exploring the dense forests that surrounded our small town. My parents were avid outdoors people. My father was a park ranger, and my mother led guided nature walks. So you could say that loving nature was in my blood. By the time I was 12, I could identify most local flora and fauna, track animals, and navigate confidently through unmarked territory. This intimate connection with nature followed me into adulthood. While my college friends spent their weekends at parties, I was more likely to be found on a secluded trail, hiking pack on my back, drinking in the silence. It was during one of these solo hiking trips that I met Sarah and Mike, two kindred spirits who shared my passion for off-trail exploration. We clicked immediately, bonding over our shared disdain for crowded tourist trails and our love of discovering hidden places that felt untouched by human presence. Over the years, we developed a reputation among our local hiking community as the Ghost Trail Group, the ones who always seemed to find the paths less traveled, the forgotten fire roads, the abandoned logging trails that didn't appear on any official maps. We prided ourselves on our ability to safely navigate these forgotten corners of the wilderness, always respecting nature while pushing the boundaries of exploration. That's what made the Maple State Forest so appealing to us. Unlike the more popular hiking destinations in the area, it remained relatively unknown, a sprawling 2,000-acre sanctuary of old-growth forest and hidden valleys. I had discovered it purely by accident 3 years ago, driving back from a disappointing hike at a more popular park that had been overrun with weekend warriors and their selfie sticks. The forest quickly became my personal refuge. I visited at least twice a month, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sarah and Mike, gradually building a mental map of its hidden wonders. We discovered abandoned stone walls deep in the woods, remnants of long-forgotten homesteads. We found pristine waterfalls that didn't appear on any trail maps, and meadows bursting with wildflowers that seemed to have never felt human footsteps. The locals had their stories about Maple State Forest, of course. Every small town has its share of wilderness legends, tales of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and mysterious disappearances. We'd heard them all during our post-hike visits to the local diner. Stories of hunters who went in and never came out, of inexplicable sounds echoing through the valleys on still nights, of shadow figures glimpsed between the trees at dusk. We dismissed them as typical small-town folklore, the kind of stories that seem to attach themselves to any sufficiently remote piece of wilderness. Looking back now, I wish we had paid more attention to those stories. I wish we had noticed the way the old-timers at the diner would fall silent when we talked about our off-trail explorations. I wish we had recognized the meaning behind their concerned glances and subtle head shakes. But we were too confident in our abilities, too secure in our knowledge of the wilderness, too certain that we understood everything there was to know about these woods. That certainty was shattered on a crisp spring morning last April, during what should have been a routine solo hike. I had done the same trail dozens of times before, always with my loyal companion Rex, a German Shepherd mix who was as comfortable in the wilderness as I was. The events of that day would fundamentally change not just my relationship with nature, but my understanding of reality itself. The day started like any other hiking day. I woke before dawn, checking my weather app as I sipped my morning coffee. The forecast promised perfect hiking conditions, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, with a light breeze, ideal for the challenging route I had planned. I had been preparing for this particular hike for several weeks. My goal was to explore a remote section of the forest I had spotted during my last visit with Sarah and Mike. We had seen what looked like an old river valley from one of the higher ridges, tucked away in a part of the forest we hadn't yet explored. The topographical maps I studied suggested it was accessible, though it would require leaving the marked trails and navigating some challenging terrain. The night before, I had meticulously packed my gear, my trustworthy hiking boots, freshly waterproofed. My 35-liter backpack containing a first aid kit, emergency shelter, water filtration system, and enough food for a full day's trek. I had also packed extra layers of clothing, knowing how temperatures could drop in the deeper valleys, especially near water sources. My preparation was thorough, perhaps even excessive for what I planned as a day hike. I had downloaded offline maps to my phone, marked potential routes on my paper topographical map, and even left a detailed plan with Sarah, including my intended route and expected return time. These were habits ingrained through years of experience, precautions that had always seemed almost ceremonial in their redundancy. After all, I knew these woods better than most people knew their own backyards. Looking back, I'm grateful for every bit of that preparation, though it would prove inadequate for what I was about to encounter. I arrived at the eastern parking lot just as the first hints of dawn were painting the sky in soft pastels. The lot was empty, which wasn't unusual. This was one of the forest's less popular access points, especially on a weekday. Rex bounded out of the car, his excitement palpable as he caught the scent of the wilderness. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of spring growth mixed with the earthy decay of last year's leaves. As we set off down the main trail, the rising sun began filtering through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The early spring foliage was just beginning to emerge, tiny leaves unfurling on the branches above, while the forest floor remained carpeted with the previous autumn's leaves. The first few miles were familiar territory. The main trail wound through stands of ancient maple and oak trees, their massive trunks testament to centuries of growth. I maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to photograph interesting fungi or unusual plant growth. Rex stayed close, as he always did, occasionally darting off to investigate an interesting scent before returning to my side. About 6 miles in, we reached the point where the old riverbed intersected the trail. This was where we would leave the marked path and begin our real adventure. The sound of running water was particularly loud that day, swollen with spring runoff. Something about the sound drew me in, more compelling than usual, almost hypnotic in its consistency. The departure from the trail marked a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved away from the maintained path, the vegetation becoming denser, the light taking on a different quality. The air felt heavier, somehow more present, as if the forest itself was becoming more aware of our presence. We followed the riverbed deeper into the unknown territory, picking our way carefully over moss-covered rocks and fallen trees. The sound of our movement seemed unnaturally loud in the dense forest, each snapped twig and shuffled leaf echoing slightly longer than it should have. I remember thinking how the acoustics felt wrong, though I couldn't quite explain why. That's when I first heard it, the sound that would mark the beginning of everything changing. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining it, what seemed like human voices, carrying on a conversation just at the edge of audibility. I stopped moving, and Rex froze beside me, his ears pricking forward. The forest fell silent, that special kind of silence that feels almost solid in its completeness. But underneath it, almost subliminal, those voices continued. They were too distant to make out words, but they had a rhythm that was unmistakably human. Yet something about them felt off. The cadence was wrong, the pitch slightly unusual, as if they were speaking a language that was almost but not quite familiar. I tried to rationalize it. Sound carries strangely in forests, especially in river valleys. It could be hikers on another trail, their voices bouncing off the valley walls in unexpected ways. But deep down, I knew that made no sense. There hadn't been any other cars in the parking lot, and we were miles from any other access point. Besides, something about those voices raised the hair on the back of my neck in a way that normal human speech never would. As the voices faded away, I made a decision that I would come to regret. Rather than turning back, I decided to investigate. My curiosity, honed by years of exploration and discovery, overrode my instincts. I convinced myself that there must be a logical explanation, and that finding it would make for an interesting story to share with Sarah and Mike. We left the riverbed and began climbing the steep hill to our right, hoping to gain some elevation and perhaps spot the source of the voices. The climb was challenging, the loose soil and dead leaves making each step treacherous. Rex seemed unusually hesitant, something I should have paid more attention to. He's usually eager to explore new terrain, but that day he stayed unusually close to my heels. Near the top of the hill, we found something that stopped me in my tracks. Hidden among the leaves and underbrush was a circle of stones, about 12 feet in diameter. These weren't natural formations. Each stone was roughly the same size and deliberately placed, creating a perfect circle. The stones themselves were unremarkable, but what caught my attention was their positioning. They were arranged with a precision that seemed impossible given their remote location. But it was what was inside the circle that truly unsettled me. The ground within the stone ring was completely bare. No leaves, no twigs, no vegetation of any kind. It was as if everything organic had been methodically removed, leaving only dark, unusually smooth soil. In the center of the circle was a single object, what appeared to be a crude figure made of twisted branches and sinew, standing about 2 feet tall. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. Rex pressed against my leg, whining softly, something he never does unless he's truly distressed. And then, breaking the unnatural silence, those voices returned. They were closer now, and clearer, though still indecipherable. They seemed to be coming from just beyond the ridge, and they had changed in character. What had earlier sounded like a casual conversation now had an urgent, almost ritualistic quality, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. The rational part of my mind was still trying to make sense of it all. Perhaps this was some kind of archaeological site, though I'd never heard of any Native American ruins in this area. Maybe the stone circle was the work of other hikers, though its precise construction and remote location made that seem unlikely. As I stood there theorizing, I noticed something else. The shadows around the stone circle seemed wrong. They didn't match the angle of the sun, and they appeared to be moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I watched, the movement became more pronounced. The shadows began to curl and twist like smoke, forming patterns that seemed almost meaningful, like a script in a language I couldn't read. The air grew colder still, and an oppressive silence fell over the forest, not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound that felt physical in its intensity. Rex's whining turned into a low growl, and I noticed his eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What I saw in that moment defies conventional description. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure that seemed to both exist and not exist simultaneously. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and changing like smoke in the wind, yet maintaining a vaguely humanoid shape. The details of its appearance seemed to slip away whenever I tried to focus on them, as if my mind refused to properly process what my eyes were seeing. The entity's head, if you could call it that, was adorned with what appeared to be the antlers of an enormous deer, but they were wrong somehow. Too many points, too twisted and gnarled. Its body was emaciated, almost skeletal, covered in what might have been fur or might have been shadows, I couldn't tell which. But its eyes I remember with perfect clarity. They glowed with an inner light that seemed to pierce right through me, ancient and hungry and utterly alien. The voices I'd been hearing suddenly made sense. They were coming from the creature, but it wasn't speaking as we understand speech. It was producing multiple voices simultaneously, each one slightly out of sync with the others, creating a haunting chorus that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. Rex, my brave companion who had faced down aggressive wildlife without flinching, turned and ran. His sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the creature. It moved, not by walking or running, but by simply being in one place and then another, like a glitch in reality. The air grew so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows around the stone circle began to writhe and reach toward me. What followed was a desperate flight through the forest that I remember only in fragments. I ran, following the sound of Rex's panicked flight ahead of me. The creature pursued us, though pursuit isn't quite the right word. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, appearing in glimpses between trees, its many voices now a cacophony of inhuman sounds that filled the forest. I lost all sense of direction, driven only by blind panic and the primitive need to get away. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I barely felt them. The forest itself seemed to have come alive, the trees appearing to shift and move in my peripheral vision, though whether this was reality or terror-induced hallucination, I couldn't say. At some point during the chase, I fell. I remember the impact, the taste of dirt and dead leaves in my mouth, the sharp pain as something cut into my palm. When I looked up, the creature was there, looming over me, its form blocking out the sky. The air grew so cold it burned my lungs, and the many voices merged into a single sound that threatened to shatter my sanity. What happened next is something I still struggle to explain. Rex, who I thought had abandoned me, suddenly reappeared. He launched himself at the creature, passing straight through its smoky form, but his actions seemed to disrupt whatever force was holding the entity together. For a brief moment its form wavered, and in that instant, I saw other things within it. Glimpses of impossible geometries and spaces that shouldn't exist. That momentary disruption was enough. I scrambled to my feet and ran, Rex now at my side. Whether by luck or some buried instinct, we eventually found our way back to the main trail. The voices faded, the unnatural cold dissipated, and the forest slowly returned to normal. The physical evidence of our encounter was minimal. Some cuts and bruises, torn clothing, and a deep gash in my palm that would leave a scar. The psychological impact, however, was profound. For weeks afterward, I was plagued by nightmares in which the creature's many voices called to me from the darkness. I became hypersensitive to shadows, constantly checking and rechecking that they fell the way they should. Rex's behavior changed too. He became extremely protective, growling at shadows and refusing to let me out of his sight. He never fully returned to his former easygoing self, and to this day, he flatly refuses to go anywhere near that forest. I tried to research what we might have encountered. I spent countless hours reading about local legends and folklore, researching Native American myths, and diving deep into obscure corners of the internet. The closest match I could find was the concept of the Wendigo from Algonquian-speaking people's folklore, but even that didn't quite fit what I'd seen. Sarah and Mike noticed the change in me. How could they not? I went from being the person who was always pushing for more challenging hikes to someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and refused to go off trail. When I finally told them what had happened, they listened without judgment, though I could see the concern in their eyes. In the months that followed, strange things continued to happen. I began finding perfect circles of dead grass in my yard, similar to the bare earth in the stone circle. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I would hear what sounded like distant voices having a conversation in an unknown language. More disturbing were the stories that began to emerge from others. After sharing my experience anonymously on some outdoor forums, I received messages from other hikers who had encountered similar phenomena in various forests across the region. Their descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The multiple voices, the cold, the shadows that moved wrong. One particular message stood out. It came from an elderly man who claimed to be a former Forest Service employee. He described similar encounters dating back to the 1960s, all centered around ancient forest regions. According to him, these incidents followed a pattern, increasing in frequency every few decades before suddenly stopping, only to begin again years later. It's been over a year since that day in the forest, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. The experience fundamentally changed how I view the natural world. The forests I once saw as peaceful sanctuaries now feel like thin veils hiding something older and stranger than humanity can comprehend. I've started hiking again, though never alone and never off trail. Sarah and Mike come with me now, and we stick to well-traveled paths in popular parks. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the trees, looking for shadows that move wrong or listening for those distinctive multiple voices. Part of me hopes I never encounter anything like that again. But another part, the part that drove me to explore those remote places in the first place, wonders what else might be out there, hidden in the deep woods. The scar on my palm has healed into a strange pattern that doesn't match the straight cut I remember receiving. Sometimes, especially on cold nights, it seems to tingle, as if responding to something I can't perceive. Rex still sleeps pressed against my bedroom door, his occasional low growls breaking the night's silence when shadows move across the wall. I've learned to live with the lingering effects of that day. The nightmares have become less frequent, though they haven't stopped entirely. I've accepted that I'll probably never fully understand what I encountered in those woods. Some mysteries, I've come to believe, are better left unexplored. But I can't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't random. The precise stone circle, the ritualistic aspect of it all. It felt like I had stumbled into something ancient and ongoing, something that existed long before humans walked these forests and will continue long after we're gone. The old stories about those woods, the ones I dismissed as local folklore, now seem less like superstition and more like warnings passed down through generations. I still have questions that keep me awake at night. Was the creature I encountered unique, or are there more like it? What was the significance of the stone circle? Why did it let me escape? But perhaps the most troubling question is this: did I truly escape, or did it simply let me go for reasons I can't understand? The Forest Service employee's message about the cyclical nature of these encounters haunts me. If he's right, if these incidents do follow a pattern, then we're approaching another peak in the cycle. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I think I can hear those multiple voices again, distant but growing closer. I've thought about moving away from this area, leaving these forests and their mysteries behind. But something keeps me here. Maybe it's the need to understand, or maybe it's something else. Something calling to me in voices that speak in languages that were old when the first humans looked up at the stars and wondered what lurked in the darkness between them. For now, I watch the forests from a distance, sharing my story as a warning to others who might venture too far off the beaten path. There are places in this world that humans weren't meant to find, secrets we weren't meant to uncover. The wilderness isn't just a playground for our weekend adventures. It's the last frontier where the unknown still holds dominion, where ancient things still walk in the shadows between the trees. If you're reading this and planning your own off-trail adventure, remember, when you venture into the deep woods, you're not just exploring uncharted territory. You're crossing a threshold into something older and stranger than our modern minds can comprehend. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you might hear voices calling in the distance, speaking in tongues that no human was meant to understand. Stay on the marked trails, keep to the well-traveled paths, and if you ever hear multiple voices having a conversation in a language you almost understand, turn back immediately. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, some questions better left unanswered, and some paths better left untaken. The wilderness is watching, and it speaks in many voices. The decision to go camping had been brewing for weeks. Our family had been feeling the weight of urban monotony, the constant hum of technology, and the suffocating proximity of neighbors. As a family of 4, myself, my husband Charles, and our 2 sons Liam and Aidan, we craved the raw authenticity of nature, the kind of experience that strips away the veneer of modern comfort and reconnects you with something primal and unfiltered. Charles works as a geological surveyor, which means our family moves frequently. Our current home was nestled in the historic Triangle of Virginia, an area rich with layers of forgotten history and whispered legends. We'd been here just over a year, and while the region fascinated us with its deep historical roots, we hadn't yet truly explored its wilderness. Preparation for our camping trips was always a meticulous process. Charles would spend hours examining topographical maps, looking for those elusive spots far from established campgrounds, places where cellular signals became weak ghosts and human interference was minimal. Our boys, Liam and Aidan, aged 10 and 12, were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. They'd inherited their parents' love for adventure and an innate comfort with being surrounded by nothing but trees, sky, and the occasional wildlife. Our dogs, Ben and Demon, a pit mix and a retriever, were also integral parts of our outdoor expeditions. They weren't just pets, but companions who seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. Little did we know how significant that awareness would become during this particular trip. The week leading up to our camping adventure was filled with anticipation. Liam and Aidan helped Charles check and repack our camping gear. High-quality tent, sleeping bags rated for low temperatures, portable cooking equipment, first aid kit, and an array of survival tools. They treated each item with a reverence that made me proud. These weren't just objects, but keys to unlocking experiences beyond our daily routine. The drive into the wilderness was quiet, punctuated by the boys' excited chatter and our dogs' occasional whines of anticipation. We'd selected a location Charles had discovered during one of his surveying expeditions, a clearing near a small stream surrounded by dense forest that seemed to breathe with an ancient, watchful presence. As we arrived and began setting up camp, the environment felt different from our previous excursions. The forest seemed unusually silent, as if holding its breath. Ben and Demon were more subdued than typical, occasionally casting wary glances into the surrounding woods. I attributed this to potential wildlife, deer perhaps, or the occasional black bear that roamed these forests. Charles was methodical in establishing our campsite. He selected a spot that offered both protection and a clear view of the starry sky, a perfect compromise between safety and the raw beauty of nature. Liam and Aidan immediately began exploring, climbing trees and tossing a tennis ball for the dogs, their youthful energy a stark contrast to the brooding silence of the forest. As evening descended, we prepared a simple meal over the campfire. The boys roasted marshmallows, their laughter echoing through the trees. We shared stories, talked about Charles's upcoming geological projects, and reminisced about previous camping trips. Everything felt normal, comfortingly routine. The first indication that something was amiss came subtly. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a gradual sensation of wrongness that crept into our awareness like a cold mist. The forest sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoots of owls, the rustling of small creatures, simply stopped. Charles was the first to notice. His hand, which had been casually holding a beer, froze mid-air. His eyes, typically relaxed during our outdoor adventures, had sharpened with an instinctive alertness I recognized from his years of geological fieldwork. "Something's not right," he whispered. I listened. Absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an unnatural, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against our eardrums. The dogs grew tense, their usual playful demeanor replaced by a rigid alertness that sent a chill down my spine. As darkness settled over our campsite, an inexplicable tension began to build. The boys were tucked into their sleeping bags, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of our lantern. I performed our nightly ritual, the story of the shoemaker and the elves, complete with exaggerated voices that never failed to make Liam and Aidan giggle. Their laughter seemed to momentarily push back against the growing unease that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Charles and I retreated to the campfire, enjoying a rare moment of adult conversation. The flames cast dancing shadows across our faces, and for a while the world felt normal. I found myself sharing childhood memories, stories of my grandfather that had recently resurfaced during my ongoing journey of self-discovery. Charles listened intently, his hand occasionally reaching for his beer, his eyes periodically checking on the tent where our sons slept. The transition was so subtle that we almost missed it. First, a gradual quieting of the forest sounds, the chirping insects, the distant calls of night birds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Then, complete silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a moment between sounds, but an oppressive, unnatural stillness that seemed to press against our eardrums. Charles was the first to notice. His body went rigid, beer bottle halfway to his mouth. "Listen," he whispered, though there was nothing to hear. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence, weighing down on us, suffocating the very air around our campsite. Our dogs, usually relaxed and playful, had gone completely still. Ben and Demon sat alert, their muscles coiled with a tension that spoke of something beyond mere animal instinct. Their eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond our campfire's light, watching something we couldn't see. "We need to get the boys," Charles said, his voice low and controlled. There was no panic, but an absolute certainty that something was wrong. Very wrong. In that moment, our peaceful family camping trip transformed into something else entirely. A descent into an experience that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the world, about safety, about the thin line between what we understand and what lurks just beyond our perception. The moment of true terror arrived with a visceral suddenness that defied rational explanation. Around 2:30 in the morning, Ben, our typically docile pit mix, began to emit a low guttural growl that was completely alien to his nature. It wasn't the playful warning of a dog sensing a squirrel or a deer. This was something deeper, a sound that seemed to originate from some primal part of his genetic memory. I woke immediately, my body responding to the dog's tension before my mind could fully process what was happening. Charles stirred beside me, his hand instinctively moving to the holster at his side, a habit from his years of work in remote geological sites. "Something's outside," I whispered, though the words felt inadequate to describe the growing sense of dread. Our SUV's interior was cramped but functional. We had quickly transformed the back area into a makeshift sleeping space when the forest's sudden silence had first unnerved us. The boys were still asleep, mercifully unaware of the growing tension. Charles started the car, the headlights cutting through the absolute darkness. What we saw defied every rational explanation we had prepared ourselves for. The creature was nothing like anything we had ever encountered in our years of outdoor experiences. At first glance, it might have resembled a large predator, but only if one's imagination stretched the very definition of predator beyond biological comprehension. Its form seemed to defy the basic rules of anatomy and physics. Imagine a creature composed of living shadow, but not just a simple silhouette. This was a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to breathe and pulse with an internal rhythm. The closest visual reference might be the symbiote from Spider-Man's Venom, but this was far more terrifying, more real. Its body moved with a liquid-like quality, black tendrils constantly shifting and reforming, creating an illusion of constant motion, even when the creature remained relatively still. The most disturbing aspect wasn't its amorphous shape, but the sense of intelligence that radiated from its form. This was no mindless beast. This was something that watched, something that understood. The eyes were what truly chilled me to my core. Pure white, not the white of an eyeball, but a complete blank whiteness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were fixed directly on our vehicle, unblinking and utterly alien. When it opened its mouth, the horror intensified. Row upon row of yellowing teeth, sharp and irregular, packed so tightly that they seemed to overlap. A long serpentine tongue flickered between those teeth, moving with a precision that suggested calculation rather than instinct. Charles gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "We need to move," he muttered, his voice tight with controlled fear. The creature seemed to understand our intention. As Charles slowly put the car into drive, its entire body shifted. No longer was it a stationary shadow. It became a predator, moving with a horrifying grace that suggested it could match our vehicle's speed. The forest became a blur of dark shapes and moonlight as Charles navigated the rough terrain. Our SUV bumped and jolted over uneven ground, the suspension protesting with each violent movement. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature, if one could call it a creature, moving between the trees. It didn't run like a normal animal. Instead, it seemed to flow between the trees, those black tendrils reaching out and pulling its mass forward. Sometimes it would disappear momentarily, only to reappear closer, always watching, always tracking. Liam and Aiden were now awake, their initial confusion quickly transforming into terror. "What is that?" Aiden whispered, his voice trembling. I wanted to provide comfort, to say something reassuring, but the words died in my throat. Ben and Demon, our typically calm dogs, were in full alert mode. Their growls had transformed into a continuous low sound that seemed to vibrate through the car's interior, a sound of pure, primal fear. The first rays of dawn began to break through the dense forest canopy. With each increment of light, the creature seemed to retreat, its form becoming less distinct, more shadowy. By the time we hit the paved road, it had vanished completely, but the memory of its presence remained burned into our consciousness. In the days and weeks following our encounter, our lives were fundamentally altered. We spoke little about that night, each of us processing the experience in our own way. Charles, always the more scientifically minded of us, began researching local folklore and unexplained phenomena. I found myself unable to sleep without leaving multiple lights on, the darkness suddenly feeling alive and watchful. The boys were changed too. Aiden became quieter, more introspective. Liam developed an almost obsessive fear of shadows, particularly those that seemed to move independently of their sources. Our dogs, once playful and relaxed, remained on constant alert, their behavior a constant reminder of what we had witnessed. We never returned to that campsite, never went camping again in those woods. And while we tried to rationalize our experience, suggesting it was a trick of light, a shared hallucination, an unknown animal, we knew the truth was far more complex. Something exists in those woods, something that watches, something that hunts, and we were fortunate enough to escape. As the miles rolled by and the forest receded behind us, I found myself wondering if I would ever truly escape what I'd experienced in those woods. The old man driving the car, who had introduced himself as Frank, kept glancing at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You want to tell me what happened back there, son?" he asked after we'd been driving for about 20 minutes. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I'd lived through it. I was staying at a cabin in the woods, I began hesitantly. Things started happening. strange things. I heard noises, saw things that shouldn't exist. And then tonight I thought I heard my cousin calling for help, but it wasn't him. It was something else. I expected Frank to laugh, to tell me I must have been dreaming or hallucinating, but he just nodded slowly, his weathered face grave in the dim light of the dashboard. "Pisgah's got its secrets," he said after a long pause. "Been living in these parts all my life, and there's things in those woods that don't fit into any natural history book, if you know what I mean." A chill ran down my spine. "You've seen something too?" Frank shook his head. "Not me personally, but I've heard stories, folks going missing, strange lights in the sky, animals acting peculiar. Most people write it off as tall tales or superstition, but you've got the look of a man who's seen something he can't explain away." We lapsed into silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. As the adrenaline of my escape began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, Frank was gently shaking my shoulder. "We're here, son," he said. I blinked, disoriented. We were parked outside a small diner, its neon sign a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Brevard," Frank replied. "Figured you could use some food and coffee. And there's a motel down the street if you need a place to stay." I nodded gratefully, realizing for the first time how hungry and thirsty I was. As we entered the diner, the smell of coffee and bacon wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. I was safe. I was back in the world of fluorescent lights and Formica tabletops, of tired waitresses and truckers on their early morning routes. As we settled into a booth and placed our orders, Frank leaned across the table, his expression serious. "Listen, son," he said in a low voice. "I don't know exactly what you saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to, but let me give you some advice. There's folks around here who've had experiences. They meet up sometimes, talk about what they've seen. Helps to know you're not alone, you know?" He scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across to me. "They're meeting tonight, if you're interested." I stared at the napkin, conflicting emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted nothing more than to forget everything that had happened, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination and too many nights alone in the woods. But another part of me knew that I'd never be able to forget, never be able to fully convince myself that it hadn't been real. "Thanks," I said, pocketing the napkin. "I'll think about it." After breakfast, Frank dropped me off at the motel. As I watched his taillights disappear down the street, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this kind stranger who had quite possibly saved my life. In my motel room, I finally allowed myself to relax. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing away the dirt and sweat of my ordeal. As I dried off, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and hardly recognized the haggard, wild-eyed man staring back at me. I spent most of the day sleeping, my body desperately catching up on days of stress and sleepless nights. When I woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. I sat on the edge of the bed, Frank's napkin in my hand, debating what to do next. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I needed answers, or at least the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address Frank had provided. The meeting was held in the back room of a local community center. As I walked in, I was struck by how ordinary everyone looked. There were maybe 24 people of various ages, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups and chatting in low voices. They could have been a book club or a neighborhood watch meeting. But as the meeting got underway and people began to share their stories, I realized I was among kindred spirits. They spoke of strange lights in the sky, of lost time and inexplicable phenomena. And some, like me, had encountered things in the depths of Pisgah that defied explanation. I listened, my heart pounding, as a woman described an encounter chillingly similar to my own, a voice calling for help, leading her deep into the woods, only to reveal something inhuman and terrifying. When she finished, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup, I found myself standing up. I saw something too," I began hesitantly. And then the words came pouring out. Everything I'd experienced over those nightmarish days in the cabin. As I spoke, I saw recognition and understanding in the eyes of those around me. For the first time since my ordeal began, I felt truly heard and believed. After the meeting, several people approached me, offering words of support and sharing their own experiences. One man, a local historian, told me about the long history of strange occurrences in the area, dating back to Native American legends of spirits in the woods. As I left the community center that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The horror of what I'd experienced was still with me, and I knew it always would be. But knowing I wasn't alone, that others had faced similar terrors and survived, gave me a strange sort of peace. In the days that followed, I grappled with what to do next. I couldn't bring myself to return to the cabin to retrieve my belongings, but I did file a report with the local authorities about my experience. They were skeptical, of course, but promised to look into it. I called my cousin from a payphone, relieved to hear his voice and confirm that he was safe. I gave him a sanitized version of events, telling him there had been some trouble at the cabin and I'd had to leave suddenly. He was concerned and apologetic, but I assured him it wasn't his fault. As for my writing career, well, I finally had a story to tell. Not the novel I'd originally planned, but something far stranger and more terrifying. I began to write, pouring my experiences onto the page, turning my nightmare into a narrative that I hoped might warn others about the dangers lurking in the dark heart of Pisgah. I'm not sure if anyone will believe my story. Most will probably dismiss it as fiction, a horror tale spun from an overactive imagination. But I know the truth. And I know that out there, in the depths of the forest, something is waiting, watching, humming its otherworldly song. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the bustling streets of Brevard, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The paranoia began to eat away at me, making it difficult to sleep or concentrate on my writing. I started attending the support group meetings regularly, finding comfort in the shared experiences of others who had encountered the unexplainable. One evening, an elderly man named George approached me after the meeting. His eyes were kind but held a sadness that spoke of a lifetime of carrying a heavy burden. "I've been listening to your story, son," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "And I think it's time I shared mine with you. It might help you understand what you're dealing with." We walked to a nearby diner, and over cups of coffee that grew cold as we talked, George unfolded a tale that chilled me to the bone. He had been a forest ranger in Pisgah National Forest back in the 1970s, and during his time there, he had witnessed things that defied explanation. "It wasn't just one incident," George explained, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "It was a series of strange occurrences over the years. Animals behaving oddly, as if they were fleeing from some unseen predator. Hikers going missing, only to turn up days later with no memory of where they'd been. And the sounds. God, the sounds." He described hearing unearthly wails echoing through the forest at night, sounds that no known animal could make. And then there were the lights, strange pulsating orbs that would appear deep in the woods, hovering just above the treetops before vanishing without a trace. "But the worst was the day I found the cave," George continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was hidden behind a waterfall, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. Inside I found paintings, ancient paintings on the walls that seemed to depict things, creatures that looked almost human but not quite, and symbols, strange symbols that hurt your eyes to look at them for too long. George had reported his findings to his superiors, but they had dismissed his concerns. The cave was written off as an undocumented Native American site, and George was warned not to spread crazy stories that might scare off tourists. "But I knew what I saw," George said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "And I think you've seen it too, or something like it. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's been there for a long, long time, and it's not going anywhere." As I listened to George's story, pieces of my own experience began to fall into place. The strange symbols I'd seen carved into trees near the cabin, the inexplicable sense of dread that had permeated the air. It all suddenly felt like part of something much larger and more ancient than I had realized. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, spending long hours at the local library poring over historical records and folklore of the region. I discovered that the area had a long history of unexplained phenomena, dating back to the earliest European settlers and beyond. Native American legends spoke of a thin place in the forest where the veil between worlds was weak, allowing spirits and otherworldly entities to cross over. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice strange occurrences in my daily life. Books I needed would fall off the shelf just as I reached for them. I'd overhear snippets of conversation that seemed eerily relevant to my investigation, and more than once, I could have sworn I saw the same figure watching me from across the street, only to disappear when I tried to get a closer look. One night, as I was walking back to my motel room after a late dinner, I felt an overwhelming sense of being followed. The street was deserted, the only sound the buzz of the streetlights and the distant bark of a dog. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached for my room key, I heard a voice behind me, a voice that sounded exactly like my cousin's. "Hey, need some help?" I spun around, my blood turning to ice in my veins. There, standing under the flickering neon of the motel sign, was a figure that looked exactly like my cousin. But something was off. The smile was too wide, the eyes too blank. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing that wasn't my cousin tilted its head at an impossible angle, its grin stretching even wider. "Are you sure about that?" it asked, its voice distorting into something inhuman. I fumbled with my key, practically falling into my room and slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, lights blazing, jumping at every sound. The next morning I called my cousin again, just to hear his voice and reassure myself that he was okay. He answered, groggy with sleep, completely unaware of my terror. I didn't tell him about what I'd seen. How could I? As the weeks turned into months, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from Pisgah and its mysteries as I could. But another part of me felt compelled to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. I began to interview other locals, gathering more stories of strange encounters and unexplained events. Some were reluctant to talk at first, but once they realized I wasn't there to mock or dismiss them, the stories came pouring out. Tales of lost time, of strange creatures glimpsed in the underbrush, of voices calling out in the night. One story in particular stuck with me. An old woman, her face lined with years of hard living, told me about her grandfather's encounter back in the 1930s. He had been a moonshiner, operating a still deep in the woods to avoid the revenuers. One night, as he was tending to his still, he heard music. Beautiful, otherworldly music that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He said it was like nothing he'd ever heard before, the old woman recounted, her eyes distant with memory. It made him want to follow it, to find its source. But something held him back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was common sense. But he packed up his still that very night and never went back into those woods again. As I collected these stories, a pattern began to emerge. The encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas of the forest, particularly in the more remote regions where few people ventured. I started mapping out the incidents, creating a web of strangeness that spread across Pisgah like a spider's web. My research led me to an old, nearly forgotten legend about a place deep in the forest known as the Whisper Hollow. According to the stories, it was a place where the boundaries between our world and something else were thin, a place where reality itself seemed to warp and bend. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the Whisper Hollow was the key to understanding what was happening in Pisgah. But finding it wouldn't be easy. The location was shrouded in mystery, with different stories placing it in different parts of the vast forest. I knew I was taking a risk by even considering going back into those woods. The memory of my terrifying experience at the cabin was still fresh in my mind. But I also knew that I would never find peace until I uncovered the truth. So I began to prepare. I bought hiking gear, studied maps of the forest, and even took a wilderness survival course. I also reached out to some of the people I'd met through the support group, asking if anyone would be willing to accompany me on my search for the Whisper Hollow. To my surprise, 3 people volunteered. Maria, a retired teacher who had her own strange encounter in the woods years ago. Dave, a local carpenter with a passion for cryptozoology. And Laura, a young graduate student studying folklore who was eager to see if there was any truth to the legends. As we planned our expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I caught glimpses of strange shadows moving at the edge of my vision, or heard whispers just on the edge of hearing. But I tried to push these fears aside, focusing instead on our preparations. The night before we were set to leave, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in a forest clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to loom impossibly tall. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water so still it looked like black glass. As I approached the pool, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The face looking back at me was ancient, its features constantly shifting and changing. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream lingering like a bad taste in my mouth. As I got ready to meet the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far beyond our understanding. Our journey into Pisgah began on a crisp autumn morning, the trees a riot of red and gold. We had decided to start our search in an area where several of the stories I'd collected seemed to overlap. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of birds and small animals gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. By the 3rd day of our expedition, we had ventured far off the marked trails, relying on our map and compass to navigate the increasingly dense forest. The air felt thick and heavy, as if we were walking through an invisible fog. Maria was the first to notice that our compasses were acting strangely, the needles spinning erratically before settling on a direction that couldn't possibly be north. "I don't like this," Dave muttered, eyeing the surrounding trees warily. "It feels like the forest is watching us." I knew exactly what he meant. There was a palpable sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very ground we walked on. More than once, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain that I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. The darkness seemed to press in around us, our campfire creating a small island of light in an ocean of shadows. We took turns keeping watch, none of us willing to leave ourselves completely vulnerable to whatever might be out there. It was during my watch, in the darkest hours of the night, that I first heard it, a faint melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was hauntingly beautiful, and I found myself straining to hear it more clearly. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others if it was just my imagination. But Laura was already sitting up in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide. "I hear it," she said softly. It's like nothing I've ever heard before." As we listened, the humming grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be calling to us, urging us to follow it deeper into the woods. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to get up and walk towards the sound, and I could see the same struggle reflected in Laura's face. Suddenly, Maria bolted upright with a gasp. "No!" she cried out, her voice thick with terror. "Don't listen to it! That's how they get you!" Her shout broke whatever spell the music had cast over us. The humming faded away, leaving behind in silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. None of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, as we broke camp, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We all knew that we had experienced something beyond the ordinary, something that couldn't be easily explained away. "Maybe we should turn back," Dave suggested, his usual enthusiasm noticeably dampened. "We're clearly dealing with forces we don't understand." Part of me agreed with him. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But another part, the part that had been driving me since that night at the cabin, knew that I couldn't turn back now. We were close to something. I could feel it. "We press on," I said, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I felt. "We came here for answers, and I intend to find them." As we continued our journey, the forest around us seemed to change subtly. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. Strange fungi in colors I had never seen before sprouted from the ground and the bark of trees. The air became thick with a sweet, cloying scent that made my head spin. It was Laura who first noticed the symbols. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak, partially obscured by moss and lichen, was a series of intricate designs that looked vaguely like writing, but in no alphabet any of us recognized. "These symbols," Laura breathed, her fingers tracing the carvings. "They're similar to ones found in some ancient Native American sites, but different. Older, somehow." As we examined the tree more closely, we realized that the symbols weren't just on this one tree, they were everywhere. Once we knew what to look for, we could see them carved into rocks, formed by the patterns of lichen on tree trunks, even seemingly drawn in the very soil beneath our feet. "It's like the whole forest is trying to tell us something," Maria said, her voice hushed with awe and fear. We spent hours documenting the symbols, Laura sketching them in her notebook while I took photographs. The more we looked, the more we found, and soon we realized that the symbols seemed to be forming a path, leading us deeper into the heart of the forest. As we followed this cryptic trail, the world around us seemed to shift and change. Colors became more vibrant, almost painfully so. Shadows moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. More than once I saw things moving just at the edge of my vision, shapes that were almost human but not quite. The air grew thick with mist, limiting our visibility to just a few feet ahead. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, whispers in a language none of us understood, the cry of birds that shouldn't exist, and always, faintly in the background, that haunting melodic humming. We lost all sense of time as we pressed on. Our watches had stopped working, and the sky above was hidden by a thick canopy of leaves. It could have been hours or days that we walked, following the trail of symbols. Finally, we emerged from the mist into a vast clearing. In the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk easily 30 feet in diameter. The bark was covered in the same strange symbols we had been following, but here they seemed to glow with an inner light. At the base of the tree was a pool of water so still it looked like a mirror. The surface reflected not the sky above, but what looked like another forest, a dark, twisted version of the one we stood in. "The Whisper Hollow," I breathed, knowing without a doubt that we had found what we were looking for. As we approached the pool, the humming we had heard earlier grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the water itself, calling to us, inviting us closer. Dave reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the pool. "What do you think happens if we touch it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before any of us could answer, a voice spoke from behind us, a voice that sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood, ancient and powerful. "You have come seeking answers," it said. "But are you prepared for the truth?" We turned, and there, emerging from the mist, was a figure that defied description. It seemed to be made of bark and leaves, its form constantly shifting and changing. Eyes like amber pools regarded us with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. "What are you?" Maria gasped, her voice trembling. The being's mouth, if you could call it that, curved into what might have been a smile. "I am the guardian of this place," it said, "the keeper of the boundary between your world and others." As it spoke, the world around us seemed to ripple and shift. I saw glimpses of other realities, worlds of impossible beauty and terrifying darkness, all layered over our own like a complex tapestry. "The veil is thin here," the guardian continued. "What you have experienced, what you have seen in these woods, they are but echoes of what lies beyond. Your kind is not meant to walk between worlds, yet some are drawn here, pulled by forces they cannot understand." I thought of all the stories I had collected, all the strange encounters and inexplicable events. "The missing hikers," I said, "the strange creatures people have seen." The guardian nodded, a slow, creaking movement. "Some find their way back. Others do not." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the full implications of what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't just about solving a mystery or uncovering a local legend. We were standing at the threshold of something far greater, far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. "Why show yourself to us now?" Laura asked, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. The guardian's form shifted, branches and leaves rearranging themselves into a new configuration. "Because you saw it, because you listened, and because the balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker, and what lies beyond grows restless." As if in response to its words, the humming from the pool grew louder, more insistent. The surface of the water began to ripple, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving beneath its surface, things that could not exist in our world. "You stand at a crossroads," the guardian said, its voice taking on an urgent tone. "What you do with the knowledge you have gained here will shape the future of both your world and others. Choose wisely." With those words, the guardian began to fade, its form dissolving back into the mist. The humming from the pool reached a fever pitch, and the world around us seemed to waver, as if reality itself was uncertain. In that moment, I knew we had a choice to make. We could turn back, try to forget what we had seen and return to our normal lives. Or we could step forward into the unknown, risking everything to uncover the full truth of what lay beyond the Whisper Hollow. As I looked at my companions, I saw the same mixture of fear and determination in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. Whatever we decided, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting for our decision. The fate of two worlds, perhaps more, hung in the balance, and as the mist swirled around us and the otherworldly music filled the air, I took a deep breath and made my choice. "We need to seal it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't let whatever's on the other side come through." Maria nodded, her face set with determination. "But how?" As if in answer, I felt a weight in my pocket. Reaching in, I pulled out a small, smooth stone, one I didn't remember picking up. It was covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen throughout the forest. Instinctively, I knew what I had to do. I approached the pool, the humming growing almost unbearable. The surface rippled violently, shapes just beneath trying to break through. With a silent prayer, I dropped the stone into the center of the pool. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The humming turned into a shriek that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The pool's surface began to churn and boil, the shapes beneath thrashing in what looked like agony. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Laura's arm and pulling her away from the pool. We fled through the forest, the world around us seeming to warp and twist, trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching for us like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet shifted and roiled, making each step a struggle. Behind us, a sound like reality itself tearing apart filled the air. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting as far away from that clearing as possible. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been hours or days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that otherworldly forest, but gradually the sounds of pursuit faded. The trees around us began to look more normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Finally, exhausted and gasping for breath, we stumbled onto a hiking trail. In the distance, we could hear the faint sounds of traffic, civilization. We looked at each other, our faces dirty and scratched, our clothes torn. No words were needed. We all knew that what we had experienced would stay with us forever. As we made our way back to town, I thought about everything we had seen and learned. The Guardian's warning echoed in my mind. The balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker. I knew then that our work wasn't over. We had closed one doorway, but how many others were out there? How many other thin places existed where the veil between worlds could be breached? In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to readjust to normal life. But the memory of our experience in Pisgah haunted us. We stayed in touch, sharing our research and keeping an eye out for any signs that the boundary might be weakening again. I continued my writing, but not the novel I had originally planned. Instead, I began documenting our experiences, encrypting the most sensitive information. I scattered clues throughout my work, breadcrumbs for those who might need this knowledge in the future. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting melody. I see shadows move in ways they shouldn't, and I wonder if we truly succeeded in sealing the breach, or if we only delayed the inevitable. One thing I know for certain: the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. There are forces out there beyond our understanding, entities that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And somewhere, in the depths of Pisgah National Forest, the Whisper Hollow waits, silent for now, but for how long? Only time will tell. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening, because now I know the truth. The veil is thin, and what lies beyond is always trying to find a way through. And when it does, someone needs to be ready to face it. That someone might just be me. The north of England holds its secrets in stone walls and narrow paths, in valleys where mill cottages huddle together like sheep against the wind. Our home was one of 15 such cottages, tucked away down a track so remote that delivery drivers would often give up before finding us. The isolation brought a particular kind of quiet, the deep silence of places forgotten by progress, where the modern world seems to hold its breath. My bedroom window faced nothing but empty sky and distant hills, which meant I could leave my curtains open at night without concern for privacy. This freedom would later become something I'd regret. On this particular night in 1968, when I was 10 years old, the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, casting the kind of half-light that transforms familiar spaces into something altogether different. The moonlight filled my room with a silvery radiance that made sleep elusive. Rather than get up to close the curtains, a task that seemed monumental to my drowsy mind, I simply turned to face the wall, letting the light paint shadows behind me. The wall was a comfort, solid and real, a barrier between me and the strange quality the moonlight gave to ordinary things. 10 minutes passed in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep when I felt it, a finger prodding my shoulder. At first I dismissed it as that common experience of falling asleep when the body sometimes jerks or twitches, but the prodding continued, becoming more insistent, more real, until it began to hurt. The pain was what finally forced me to turn around, to face whatever was demanding my attention. What I saw defied all logic and reason. Kneeling beside my bed, as solid and real as the wall I'd been facing moments before, was a soldier in a Union Army uniform. The moonlight seemed to gather around him, illuminating every detail with an impossible clarity. His uniform was the deep blue of the northern states, adorned with brass buttons that caught the light despite their tarnished surface. His hat, dusty and battle-worn, bore the crossed swords insignia in faded gold. His face remains etched in my memory with a clarity that defies the passage of time. It was round and full, the skin tanned as if from long hours under a foreign sun. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the moonlight like tiny diamonds, a detail so precise and unexpected that it helps convince me even now that this was no dream. His black hair showed beneath the battered cap, and when he smiled, his teeth gleamed with an unnatural whiteness against his weathered skin. That smile, there was something both comforting and terrifying about it, as if he was trying to be reassuring but had forgotten exactly how human expressions worked. It didn't reach his eyes, which held a depth of experience that seemed impossible for me to comprehend at 10 years old. Those eyes spoke of battles fought on distant shores, of comrades lost in fields I'd never see, of a war that had no business reaching across an ocean and decades to find me in my little mill cottage bedroom. Terror gripped me with physical force. I tried to scream for my mother, but my voice betrayed me, trapped somewhere between my racing heart and dry throat. It was as if the moonlight itself had stolen my ability to make sound, leaving me in a bubble of silent horror with this impossible visitor. The contrast between his solid presence and my inability to cry out made everything feel even more surreal, like being trapped in a photograph where only he could move. In desperation, I did what children have done for generations when faced with the unexplainable. I pulled the sheets over my head, creating a flimsy barrier between myself and whatever reality had decided to break its own rules that night. The cotton felt damp against my skin, and I realized I was sweating despite feeling cold enough for my teeth to chatter. This paradox of hot and cold seemed to mirror the impossible nature of what was happening. A Civil War soldier from another continent, another century, kneeling by my bed in the north of England. When morning finally came, seeping through the sheets I'd used as a shield, I emerged to find my room restored to its ordinary state. The soldier was gone, leaving no trace of his visit, no footprints in the carpet, no indentation where he'd knelt beside my bed, not even a lingering scent of gunpowder or leather that might have confirmed his presence. The morning light seemed to mock my memory of the night before, transforming everything back to the mundane world of a mill cottage bedroom. My parents' response was predictable, delivered with the gentle dismissiveness adults reserve for children's nightmares. "Just a dream," they said, exchanging those knowing looks that parents share when they think they understand something their child doesn't. But how could it have been a dream when I can still recall the specific pattern of brass buttons on his uniform, the way his sword insignia had been slightly askew on his cap, the individual beads of sweat on his forehead? What makes the experience even more compelling is my complete lack of context for what I'd seen. In 1968, my education consisted largely of British history, endless lessons about Henry VIII and his wives, the Tudor dynasty, and local industrial revolution history. The American Civil War might as well have been taking place on another planet for all I knew about it. I had no frame of reference for what a Union soldier's uniform should look like, no knowledge of military insignias or rankings. Yet years later, when I finally saw historical photographs of Civil War soldiers, every detail matched what I'd seen that night. The question that has haunted me for decades remains: why would a soldier from the American Civil War appear to a 10-year-old British child? What possible connection could exist between a battle-worn Union soldier and a mill cottage in northern England? There are theories, of course. Stories of British volunteers who fought in the American Civil War, of uniforms and equipment manufactured in English mills, of spiritual energy somehow transcending both time and geography. But none of these explanations feel entirely satisfactory. Looking back now, with decades of historical research and life experience behind me, the encounter feels even more extraordinary. Our mill cottage, I later learned, had been part of the textile industry that played such a crucial role in the American Civil War. The very walls that surrounded me that night may have housed looms that wove cloth for Union uniforms, creating an unexpected thread connecting my small corner of England to that distant conflict. The precision of the details I remember becomes more remarkable with time. Every aspect of his uniform that I can recall, from the shade of blue to the placement of the buttons, matches historical records exactly. The crossed swords on his cap, I would later discover, were a common cavalry insignia. These are details that a 10-year-old in 1968 England, whose television exposure was limited to BBC programming, and whose history lessons focused firmly on British monarchy, simply couldn't have invented. That moment of connection across time and space seems to suggest something profound about the nature of history and memory. Perhaps the walls of our old mill cottage had absorbed more than just the sounds of looms and the smell of cotton. Perhaps they held echoes of a time when northern England's industrial heartland was inextricably linked to a war being fought an ocean away, when the fate of American democracy partially rested on the output of these humble buildings. The soldier's expression, that mixture of warmth and otherworldliness in his smile, takes on new meaning now. Was he trying to acknowledge this connection? Was his presence some kind of recognition of the role these small mill cottages played in the great conflict he had been part of? The beads of sweat on his forehead, the dust on his uniform, the weathered tan of his skin, all spoke of recent battle, as if he had stepped directly from some Civil War battlefield into my moonlit bedroom. Sometimes, on full moon nights when the light falls just so across my old photographs and history books, I find myself wondering if he appears to others, this soldier so far from his home and time. Does he visit other mill cottages? Other children whose ancestors might have contributed in some small way to his cause? Or was there something specific about that night, that place, that child, that drew him across the boundaries of time and space? The reality of what I experienced has never diminished with time. If anything, my conviction has grown stronger as I've learned more about the period, about the deep connections between northern England's mills and the American Civil War. That night in 1968 remains as clear in my memory as the morning dew on the hills outside our cottage, a moment when history reached out with a tangible hand and reminded a young child that the past is never as distant as we might think. There's an old saying that history doesn't die. It simply sleeps in the walls of the places where it was made. Perhaps that's what I witnessed, a moment when history stirred in its slumber, when the moonlight and silence and isolation created the perfect conditions for time's boundaries to blur. The soldier's visit stands as a reminder that the connections between places and events, between past and present, are far more complex and mysterious than our ordinary understanding allows. Now, whenever I read about the Civil War or see images of Union soldiers, I find myself looking for his face among them. I never expect to find it. Somehow I know that his identity, like his purpose that night, will remain a mystery. But the experience has left me with a profound appreciation for the hidden threads that connect seemingly disparate moments in history, and the ways in which the past can manifest itself in the most unexpected places and times. The moonlight still carries a different quality for me now, decades later. On full moon nights, I sometimes find myself watching the silvery light and wondering if somewhere, in another small mill cottage, a child is meeting a soldier from a distant war, learning as I did that history is not just something we read about in books. Sometimes it kneels beside our bed and smiles, leaving us forever changed by its visit. My name is Robert Hughes, and I am 72 years old. This is the story of how my life changed forever on October 12, 2008. I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park for almost 5 years, longer than I typically hang around anywhere. The mountains, something about their quiet power, it gets in your blood. I never planned on staying here this long. Most of my adult life has been spent drifting from one place to another, never quite finding somewhere that felt like home. I've worked as a logger in the Pacific Northwest, a ranch hand in Texas, even did a stint as a fisherman up in Alaska. But nothing ever stuck. There was always this restlessness in me, an itch that said it was time to move on. Then I came to Glacier. The first time I saw those jagged peaks piercing the sky, their faces scarred by ancient glaciers, something in me settled. It was like a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing had finally clicked into place. I applied for a ranger position on a whim, figuring I'd give it a season or two before the wanderlust kicked in again. But here I am, 5 years later, still captivated by this place. Most days are routine. I wake up before dawn in my small cabin on the outskirts of the park. The morning air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sometimes, if the wind is right, a hint of snow from the higher elevations. I brew a strong pot of coffee, the kind that puts hair on your chest, and watch the sun creep over the mountaintops, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of pink and gold. My days are filled with trail maintenance, making sure the paths are clear and safe for visitors. I chat with tourists, reminding them gently but firmly about park rules. Don't feed the bears, I tell them, my voice gruff but not unkind. It's not good for them, and it's definitely not good for you. Sometimes I have to bite back a chuckle at the wide-eyed looks I get, especially from city folk who've never seen a wild animal bigger than a raccoon. Occasionally there's the excitement of a lost hiker. Those are the days when adrenaline pumps through my veins, when every skill I've learned over the years is put to the test. There's nothing quite like the relief of finding someone who's been out there alone, scared, and bringing them back to safety. But it's the quiet moments I live for, those times when I'm out on the trail miles from the nearest person, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. The air is so clean it almost hurts to breathe. The silence is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees or the distant cry of an eagle. In those moments I feel small, insignificant, just another part of this vast, ancient place. And oddly enough, that feeling brings me more peace than anything else in my life ever has. It's a reminder that my problems, my worries, they're all temporary. These mountains have stood for millions of years. They'll be here long after I'm gone. But on October 12, 2008, everything changed. The peace I'd found in these mountains was shattered, replaced by a horror I still struggle to comprehend. It started like any other day. I woke up, made my coffee, watched the sunrise. The air had a bite to it, hinting at the winter to come. I remember thinking it might be time to start warning hikers about the changing weather conditions. I headed into the ranger station, nodding a greeting to Sarah, the young woman who manned the front desk. She was fresh out of college, full of enthusiasm for the job. Sometimes her eagerness grated on my nerves, but mostly I admired her passion. "Morning, Rob," she said, her voice tense. That immediately put me on alert. Sarah was usually all smiles and cheer. "We've got a situation." I frowned, setting down my thermos. "What kind of situation?" Sarah bit her lip, glancing down at a report on her desk. "Got a call from some hikers up near Lake Josephine. They found an abandoned campsite. Said it looked wrong." "Wrong how?" I asked, my frown deepening. "They said the tent was ransacked, food scattered everywhere. No sign of the campers." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. "They said it felt spooky." I nodded slowly, processing the information. "Could be a bear," I mused. "Wouldn't be the first time one's torn up a campsite looking for food." But even as I said it, something didn't sit right. Bears were a common enough problem in the park, but they usually left pretty clear signs. And experienced campers, the kind who'd be out near Lake Josephine this late in the season, knew how to properly store their food to avoid attracting wildlife. "I'll head up there and check it out," I told Sarah. "Radio if anything else comes in about it." She nodded, relief clear on her face. I guess when you're young, it's comforting to pass problems on to someone older, someone you think has all the answers. If only she knew how little I really understood about what was coming. I packed my gear methodically, my mind running through possible scenarios. Maybe it was just an inexperienced group of campers who'd gotten spooked by normal forest sounds and taken off in a hurry. Or it could be a medical emergency. Someone had gotten hurt, and their companions had rushed them out for help, leaving the campsite in disarray. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was something else. Something worse. As I shouldered my pack and headed out, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something that would change everything. If I'd known then what I know now, would I have still gone? Or would I have run as far and as fast as I could in the other direction? I'd like to think I'd still go. That the sense of duty that's been a part of me all these years would win out over fear. But the truth is, I just don't know. What I do know is this. As I set out on that crisp October morning, I was still Robert Hughes, park ranger. By the time the sun set, I would be something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in this world of mountains and forests. Something monstrous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about that hike, about how the world I knew began to unravel, thread by terrible thread. The trail to Lake Josephine is beautiful, even by Glacier National Park standards. It winds through dense forests of lodgepole pine and western red cedar, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. On a normal day, I'd take my time, pausing to appreciate the play of light through the leaves, or to watch a marmot sunning itself on a rock. But this wasn't a normal day. From the moment I set foot on the trail, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Now, if you've never spent much time in the wilderness, you might think forests are always quiet, but that's not true at all. A healthy forest is alive with sound. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. This silence was different. Oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I've been in the woods long enough to trust my instincts, and every one of them was screaming that something was wrong. My hand kept drifting to the pistol holstered at my hip. I've never been much for guns. Always figured my brain and my knowledge of the land were better weapons out here. But right then, I was damn glad to have it. The trail twisted and turned through the trees, each bend revealing more of the same eerie quiet. I found myself moving more cautiously, placing each foot with care to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. It was silly, really. I was there to find missing campers, not sneak up on them. But something primordial in me, some ancient survival instinct, demanded stealth. About an hour into the hike, I caught my first concrete sign that something was amiss. There, snagged on a low-hanging branch, was a scrap of blue fabric. It looked like it might have come from a jacket or a sleeping bag. I carefully removed it from the branch, my fingers trembling slightly as I examined it. The edges were frayed, but not in a way that suggested normal wear and tear. It was as if the fabric had been violently torn, and there, barely visible against the blue, were a few dark spots. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized it was blood. I bagged the scrap of fabric, my mind racing. This wasn't looking like a simple case of campers spooked by nighttime noises anymore. Something had happened here, something violent. As I continued up the trail, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I found myself jumping at shadows, my imagination populating the silent forest with all manner of threats. Was it a bear attack? A mountain lion? Or, and this thought chilled me to my core, was it something human? In all my years as a ranger, I dealt with my fair share of human threats. Lost hikers turning on each other as panic and dehydration set in. The occasional unstable individual seeking isolation in the wilderness. Even on rare and terrible occasions, the aftermath of murder. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I was about to find. The campsite came into view suddenly. One moment I was surrounded by trees, the next I was standing at the edge of a small clearing. And what I saw there, God, even now, years later, I struggle to describe it. The tent was shredded. Not just torn open like you might see in a bear attack, but literally ripped to pieces. Strips of nylon were scattered across the clearing like some kind of demented confetti. Sleeping bags, clothes, and camping gear were strewn about, as if something had been violently searching through them, or playing with them. The thought came unbidden, and I felt my skin crawl. There was something deeply wrong about the scene, something that went beyond mere destruction. It was as if whatever had done this had taken a perverse joy in it. And then there was the smell. A sickly, sweet odor hung in the air, cloying and thick. It reminded me of rotting meat, but there was something else underneath, something I couldn't quite place. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. My hand dropped to my holstered pistol, fingers wrapping around the grip. Part of me wanted to draw it, to have some illusion of protection against whatever had caused this devastation. But I resisted the urge. If this was the work of a bear or some other large predator, the noise of a gunshot might attract it back to the area. I forced myself to approach the remains of the tent, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the campers. There were no bodies, which I tried to take as a good sign. Maybe they had managed to escape, to flee whatever had attacked their camp. But as I drew closer, I saw something that shattered that faint hope. There, on the side of a tree at the edge of the clearing, was a splash of dark red, blood. And next to it, gouged deep into the bark, were claw marks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were too large for a bear, too widely spaced. And the pattern was all wrong. It looked almost deliberate, as if whatever had made them had been trying to leave a message. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was beyond anything in my experience, beyond anything I'd ever heard of or imagined. That's when I saw the pile. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a jumble of cloth and shapes at the far edge of the clearing. But as I forced myself to look closer, to really see what was in front of me, the horror of it hit me like a physical blow. It was mostly clothes, shredded even further than the tent had been. They were stained dark with blood, so much blood. And mixed in with the fabric, gleaming white in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, were fragments of bone. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't an animal attack. This was something far, far worse. Training took over, pushing through the fog of fear and revulsion. I had to secure the area, look for any signs of survivors, report back to base. My movements felt mechanical, disconnected from the screaming panic in my mind. I started at what remained of the tent, moving outward in a slow spiral. I found more blood spatter, more torn scraps of clothing. Each discovery was like another weight on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. And then I saw the hand. It was partially hidden under a fallen branch, and at first I thought, I hoped, it was just an oddly shaped piece of wood. But as I drew closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a human hand, or at least it had been. The fingers were wrong. Too long, too thin, ending in black claws that looked like chipped obsidian. The skin was a sickly gray color, mottled with patches of what looked like fur. I fell back, scrambling away from the grotesque appendage. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This was impossible. It had to be some kind of prop, a sick joke left by twisted campers. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The wrongness of it, the alien nature of its form, it was too perfect, too terrible to be fake. As that realization sank in, the world around me seemed to lurch into hyperfocus. Every detail of the forest stood out in sharp relief. The play of light and shadow through the leaves, the rough texture of tree bark, the soft give of the mossy ground under my feet, and the movement at the edge of the clearing. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of motion, there and gone so fast I might have thought I imagined it. But the prickling of my skin, the cold sweat breaking out across my brow, told me it was real. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in this world of sunlight and trees. I turned slowly, my hand inching towards my gun. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the unnatural silence more oppressive than ever. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees, stood something. It was tall, far taller than any human. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, jointed in ways that made my mind recoil. And its face, God, its face. Where there should have been features, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank canvas of flesh that somehow still managed to convey a sense of hunger, of malevolence. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror. It, utterly still, save for a slight swaying, like a tree in a breeze that didn't exist. Then it moved. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, the next it was on top of me. I didn't see it run or jump. It was just there, its impossible form looming over me, those terrible clawed hands reaching for my face. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed like I've never screamed before, a sound of pure animal terror ripped from the depths of my soul. My body reacted on pure instinct. My hand found my gun, pulled it free of its holster. I fired blindly, the sound deafening in the confined space of the clearing. The creature hissed, a long, scratchy sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It recoiled, not in pain, but in what seemed almost like surprise. I scrambled backwards, my free hand scrabbling at the forest floor, desperate for any purchase. My chest burned where the creature's claws had raked across it, but there was no blood. Instead, the flesh bubbled and blistered, as if I'd been splashed with acid. The creature tilted its head, that blank face somehow radiating curiosity. Then, in a movement that still haunts my nightmares, that smooth expanse of skin split open. Not in a mouth, nothing so mundane or comprehensible. It was as if reality itself tore apart, revealing a void of absolute darkness. And from that void came a sound, not a roar or a screech, but a vibration that I felt more than heard. It resonated through my body, setting my teeth on edge and making my vision blur. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I was on my feet and running before I even realized I'd moved. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction, all thought of the trail or my duties as a ranger, had been obliterated by a blind panic. I just ran, driven by the PR I just ran, driven by the primal need to escape, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The forest blurred around me, a green and brown smear punctuated by the sharp sting of branches whipping across my face. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp that didn't seem to bring enough air. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare, because it was behind me. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it over the pounding of my heart and the crash of my clumsy flight through the underbrush. But I could feel it. A presence, vast and hungry, always just a step behind. Time lost all meaning. I could have been running for minutes or hours. My world narrowed to the ground in front of me, the burning in my muscles, and the constant gnawing fear. Then, miraculously, I burst out onto a familiar trail. For a brief, shining moment, hope flared in my chest. I knew this path. If I could just follow it, I could make it back to the ranger station, to safety. But that hope was short-lived. As I staggered onto the packed earth of the trail, I heard something, a sound that didn't belong in these woods, that shouldn't exist in any sane, rational world. It was laughter, high and cruel, echoing through the trees with a glee that was somehow worse than any roar of rage could have been. I spun around, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. And there it was, standing at the edge of the trees. Its elongated limbs seemed to ripple, as if they couldn't quite decide on a shape. That blank face was turned towards me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze boring into me. Then I saw the movement behind it. A flash of blonde hair, the bright colors of hiking gear. Another hiker, oblivious to the danger, coming up the trail. Time seemed to slow. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, to tell them to run. But before I could make a sound, the creature moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for my eyes to track. One moment it was in front of me, the next it was on the trail behind me. I heard a startled cry, cut horribly short. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. Instead, I did the one thing my training, my duty as a ranger, screamed against. I ran. I plunged back into the trees, away from the trail, away from what I knew was happening behind me. Branches tore at my clothes. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. As I ran, the light began to fade. Whether from the setting sun or gathering storm clouds, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that darkness was falling, and with it my chances of survival were dwindling. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning, but eventually my body betrayed me. My legs, burning with exhaustion, finally gave out. I collapsed to the forest floor, gasping for breath, my heart feeling like it might burst from my chest. For a long moment I lay there waiting for the end. Surely the creature would be upon me at any moment, those terrible claws reaching for me. But nothing. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. The forest around me was dark now, the trees looming shadows in the gloom. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. There was nothing. No rustle of leaves, no crack of breaking branches. Just the oppressive silence that had fallen over the woods since this nightmare began. As my panic began to subside, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, I became aware of a new sensation. Pain, sharp and insistent, radiated from my chest where the creature's claws had raked me. With trembling hands, I unbuttoned my shirt. In the fading light, I could just make out the wounds. But they weren't bleeding. Instead, the flesh was red and blistered, as if I'd been splashed with acid. And as I watched, horrified, I saw something moving under my skin. Dark veins pulsing and writhing, spreading out from the wounds. A wave of nausea washed over me. Whatever that thing was, it had done more than just scratch me. It had infected me with something. I rebuttoned my shirt with shaking hands, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. I needed to think, to plan. I couldn't stay out here in the open. The creature might still be hunting me, and even if it wasn't, the wilderness held plenty of other dangers for someone alone and injured. My eyes fell on a large, hollow tree trunk nearby. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter of a sort. Gritting my teeth against the pain in my chest, I crawled over to it and squeezed inside. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to curl up in, but it felt safer than being out in the open. I huddled there in the darkness, every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl sending a fresh spike of fear through me. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The destroyed campsite, the remains I'd found, the creature that defied all logic and reason. And now, whatever was happening to me, this infection spreading through my body, I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. My sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares of elongated limbs and faceless horrors. Every time I jerked awake for a terrifying moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I cautiously emerged from my hiding place. My body ached, stiff from being crammed into the small space all night. The wounds on my chest throbbed, a constant reminder of the horror I'd faced. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. In the panic of my flight, I'd lost all sense of direction. I could be miles from any trail, from any hope of rescue. But I couldn't stay here. I needed to find my way back, to warn others about what was out there in the woods. And though I could barely bring myself to think about it, I needed help. The infection or whatever it was that was spreading through me, I had no idea what it might do. With a deep breath, I picked a direction and started walking. Each step was an effort, my body protesting after the ordeal it had been through. But I forced myself to keep moving. As I walked, I tried to piece together what had happened. The creature I'd seen, it defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It moved in ways that shouldn't be possible, had abilities that seemed more at home in a horror movie than in reality. And yet I'd seen it, felt its claws on my skin. It was real, as impossible as that seemed. More than once I thought I heard something moving in the woods around me. Each time I froze, my heart pounding, sure that at any moment I'd see that elongated figure step out from behind a tree. But nothing ever appeared. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally heard a sound that didn't fill me with dread. Water. A stream or river not too far off. If I could find it, it might lead me back to a trail, or at least give me a better idea of where I was. I altered my course, heading towards the sound. As I got closer, I could see glimpses of sunlight reflecting off water through the trees. Hope, fragile but persistent, began to bloom in my chest. Maybe I would make it out of this after all. Then I stepped into a clearing by the water's edge, and that hope shattered. There, sprawled on the rocky shore, was a body, or what was left of one. It was the hiker I'd seen on the trail, the one the creature had taken. Her bright hiking clothes were in tatters, stained dark with blood. Her limbs were twisted at impossible angles, bones protruding through torn flesh. But worst of all was her face. Her eyes were gone, leaving dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at me. And her mouth, it was stretched wide in a silent scream, jaw dislocated, lips peeled back to reveal blood-stained teeth. I fell to my knees, bile rising in my throat. This was my fault. If I'd warned her, if I'd tried to help instead of running. As I knelt there, overcome with guilt and horror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the water. What I saw made my blood run cold. My skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor. Dark veins stood out starkly against my neck and face, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. And my eyes, the whites had turned black, my irises a sickly yellow. I scrambled back from the water's edge, a scream building in my throat. What was happening to me? What was I becoming? Before I could process what I'd seen, I heard it. That terrible scratching laugh, echoing through the trees. Close, too close. I lurched to my feet, panic giving me strength I didn't know I had left. I plunged back into the forest, running blindly, no thought in my head but escape. But even as I ran, a part of me knew it was futile. Whatever that creature was, whatever it had done to me, I couldn't escape it. Not really. Because now, a part of it was inside me, growing, changing me. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I could feel a hunger awakening. A hunger that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with the terror I'd seen in that poor hiker's dead eyes. I ran on deeper into the shadows of the forest, but with each step, I knew I wasn't just running from the creature anymore. I was running from what I was becoming. Days blurred together as I wandered the wilderness, lost in more ways than one, The infection, or whatever it was, continued to spread. I could feel it coursing through my veins, changing me bit by bit. My reflection, caught in still pools of water or the occasional stream, became a stranger to me. My skin grew paler, almost translucent, dark veins visible beneath the surface. My fingers lengthened, the nails hardening into something more like claws. And the hunger, God, the hunger, it gnawed at me constantly, a craving for something I couldn't name but instinctively knew I shouldn't want. I avoided trails and campsites, driven by some instinct to stay away from people. Part of it was fear of what they'd do if they saw what I was becoming. But there was another part, a part that grew stronger each day, that wanted to seek them out for entirely different reasons. I subsisted on berries and whatever small animals I could catch, but it did little to satisfy the growing hunger inside me. Each night, my dreams were filled with visions of blood and terror, and each morning I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth. It was on the 7th day, or was it the 8th? Time had lost all meaning, that I saw it again, the creature, my creator, my destroyer. I was huddled in the hollow of a massive old tree, shivering despite the warm summer air, when I felt it. A presence, vast and alien, pressing against my mind. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the edge of the small clearing. It looked different. Or maybe I was seeing it differently. Its form seemed more solid now, less like a sketch of a nightmare and more like a terrible reality. Its limbs were still impossibly long, its body unnaturally thin. But now I could see details I'd missed before. Its skin was a patchwork of textures, in some places smooth and pale, in others rough and bark-like. Its hands ended in those terrible obsidian claws, but they seemed almost delicate now, like surgical instruments. And its face, God, its face. Where before there had been only a blank expanse, now there were features. Not human features, nothing so mundane. Instead, its face was a constantly shifting array of shapes and patterns, like a living kaleidoscope. The only constant was the eyes, deep black pits that seemed to draw in all light. It stood there, watching me. I waited for the panic to set in, for the desperate need to flee. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt curiosity, a desire to understand. Slowly, painfully, I crawled out of my hiding place. I stood on shaky legs, facing the creature that had destroyed my life, had turned me into whatever I was becoming. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, it spoke. Not in words, not really. It was more like impressions, images and sensations forced directly into my mind. I saw flashes of other worlds, realities so alien they made my mind recoil. I saw versions of Earth where humanity had never evolved, where other, stranger forms of life ruled. And I saw the creature moving between these realities, feeding, changing, evolving. It was a hunter, yes, but it was also an explorer, a scientist of sorts. It sought out new forms of life, new experiences, and when it found something interesting, it experimented. I was its latest experiment. As this understanding settled over me, I felt something inside me shift. The hunger that had been gnawing at me changed, focused. I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I needed to feed, not on berries or rabbits, but on something far more vital. The creature must have sensed this change. It tilted its head, that kaleidoscope face swirling in what I somehow knew was approval. Then, with a motion almost too fast to follow, it pointed, east, towards the edges of the park, towards civilization. Then it was gone, disappearing between one blink and the next, leaving me alone with my newfound hunger and terrible understanding. I stood there for a long time, wrestling with what I'd learned, with what I knew I needed to do. The part of me that was still Robert Hughes, park ranger and protector, recoiled at the thought. but that part was growing smaller by the moment, being consumed by something older, hungrier. In the end, I didn't make a conscious decision. My feet simply started moving, carrying me eastward, towards people, towards food. As I walked, I felt my body continuing to change. My muscles grew lean and wiry, incredibly strong. My senses sharpened. I could hear the heartbeat of a squirrel 50 feet away, could smell a hiker's sweat from a mile off. By the time I reached the edge of the park, 3 days later, the transformation was complete. I caught sight of myself in a still pool of water and barely recognized what I saw. My body was elongated, my limbs impossibly thin yet corded with muscle. My skin was a pale gray, textured like tree bark in some places. My face, it wasn't the swirling kaleidoscope of the creatures, but it was far from human. My features seemed to shift and change depending on how I looked at them, never quite settling into a recognizable form. Only my eyes remained somewhat familiar, though the whites were now black and the irises a luminous yellow. I knew I should feel horror at what I'd become, but all I felt was hunger. I smelled them before I saw them, a family out for a late evening hike, the parents laughing at some shared joke. 2 children, young, their high voices carrying through the trees. I moved without conscious thought, my new body gliding through the forest with impossible silence and speed. In moments, I was upon them. What happened next? I don't like to think about it. The screams, the begging, the wet sounds of tearing flesh, the taste of their fear somehow more satisfying than even their blood. When it was over, when the hunger was finally blessedly quiet, I looked down at what I'd done, at the broken bodies, the wide staring eyes, and I felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt, only a faint satisfaction, like I'd completed a particularly challenging task. That's when I knew. Robert Hughes was gone. Whatever I was now, it wasn't human, not anymore. I turned and melted back into the forest, already feeling the hunger beginning to stir again. There would be more hikers, more campers, more food. And as I hunted, as I fed, I knew I'd be watching, waiting for someone special, someone strong, someone interesting, someone who could become like me. A new experiment, a new evolution. The creature that had changed me was gone, moved on to other realities, other hunts. But its legacy lived on in me, and I would continue its work. So if you're reading this, if you found this journal I've left behind, consider it a warning. The thing you've heard about in campfire stories, the monster in the woods that no one really believes in. It's real, and it's hungry. And somewhere out there in the vastness of Glacier National Park, I'm waiting, watching. Maybe I'll see you on the trail someday. Maybe you'll be the next to change.